MedCram.com.
Welcome to another MedCram COVID-19 update. There's been a video that's been going around that captures an exchange in the European Parliament between a member and a Pfizer representative. And the question is, was the Pfizer COVID vaccine tested on stopping the transmission of the virus before it entered the market? And the Pfizer representative said no. Now, this exchange has been characterized by some as being a bombshell, as being news, as being something that the Pfizer representative admitted to. And also, it has been characterized as completely upending the science on the ability of the COVID-19 vaccines to prevent transmission of SARS-CoV-2. Is that actually the case? Let's take a look. So here we have at the top SARS-CoV-2. And as you can see, what happens here is that it infects a person, and that's the primary case. And from there are trickle-down effects that happen very inefficiently. So only about 3.4% hospitalization occurs, and then from there, the patient may go to the critical care as a percentage of hospitalization, and then finally, they may die as a percentage of critical care involvement. So as we go down this line here, the number of people that reach this endpoint is dramatically reducing. Same thing if we go down here to secondary cases. That would be a transmission from one person to another. So imagine that you're a vaccine maker and you want to make a vaccine that prevents these things. You're going to want to get the most amount of patients into your trial as possible so you can reach an endpoint. What do I mean by that? Imagine that you're a mile away and I have a pile of dirt and I have another pile of dirt. And from a mile away, you can't tell the difference between those two piles of dirt. You have to get closer. And the closer you get, the better you're able to resolve the differences between those two peaks of dirt. It's the same sort of thing if you're looking at something on a screen that has low resolution. It's difficult to see through the pixelation. You need a better and better resolution to be able to see the difference. Well, that's the same sort of thing in studies. When you are doing a study, you're trying to resolve the difference about whether or not a vaccine is going to help with a virus. And the way you do that is by increasing the number of patients. Well, the problem is, to resolve death, that's a very small pile of dirt, and you're going to have to get really, really close to be able to see that. You're going to have a level of resolution that is pretty good. I mean, it's going to be 4K, and the reason is because only 1% of people who get infections will actually go to death. And so that's the same thing not only for death, but also for critical care, for hospitalization, and even, here's the key, for secondary cases. Secondary cases happen as a result of primary cases, but you're going to have more people to be able to see whether or not there are secondary cases, because you have to see, first of all, whether or not a primary case happens, and then you need to watch them and test people around them to see if there's a secondary case. The bottom line is it takes a lot more people to do that in your study. It takes a lot more time, and it takes a lot more money. And all you really need to show to get emergency use authorization for your vaccine is to show that you can block this. You can block primary infection. That's all you have to show to get emergency use authorization. You don't need to show that you can block this. You don't need to show that you can block this. You don't need to show that you can block this. You don't need to show that you can block this. All of those are not necessary for emergency use authorization. So you have a choice. Do you want to pay 10 times the amount of money and get 10 times more people and have your study last 3 or 4 or 5 times as long to get the same emergency use authorization? Or do you just want to see whether or not you can get emergency use authorization based on the fact that you can prevent disease in the person getting the vaccine, the recipient? You can obviously see what the best answer is. This doesn't mean that you won't do these studies. It just means that you won't do it before it goes to market. In other words, you don't need to do it before emergency use authorization, only after emergency use authorization. Let's delve into that and see if that is a dirty secret or a well-known fact. So here's an article that I want you to look at, and notice first that it was published on the 21st of October of 2020. Let me state that again. October of 2020. That was even before we had emergency use authorization for any vaccine. And this was published in the British Medical Journal, written by Peter Doshi. Will COVID-19 vaccines save lives? Current trials aren't designed to tell us that. Well, yeah, in order to tell us whether or not it saves lives, you have to power it for death. And death is such a rare event at this point in time that you would have to have a lot of people in that study to be able to do that. It says here, severe illness requiring hospital admission, which happens in only a small fraction of symptomatic COVID-19 cases, would be unlikely to occur in significant numbers in trials. 3.4% hospitalization rate. You would have to involve 30,000 or more to be able to do the trial, and you would actually need more than that to be able to look at severe disease because there'd only be a few, even in a trial of 30,000. And actually, the Pfizer trial was 36,000. They say in all the ongoing phase 3 trials, this is a key word here, phase 3 trials. This is the phase right before emergency use authorization. And in all of them, we'll talk about this, for which details have been released, laboratory confirmed infections, even with only mild symptoms, qualify as meeting the primary endpoint of definition. In the Pfizer and Moderna's trials, for example, people with only a cough and positive laboratory test would bring those trials one event closer to their completion. In other words, they're going to count that as an event. In other words, they made up their minds already. This is what they're going after. Primary cases. They're not going after hospitalization. They're not going after critical care. They're not going after preventing death. And they are not, importantly, going after secondary cases. Why? Because it would cost way too much money and it would take way too long to be able to get to that endpoint. You have to realize here that it's not just a matter of money and time, but realize that people are literally dying in the hospital while this is going on. And so the question is if they can get something that can prevent infection in the primary case, that may be all they need to do to eventually prevent death down the road. They could actually do a study down the road to figure that out. Why spend the time now trying to figure all this stuff out when it could delay the implementation of this vaccine to the market? Here is the table that is associated with that article that was published back in October of 2020. You can see here you've got the different vaccines, Moderna, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Janssen, Sinopharm, Sinovac, and you can see that the number of people that they have in their trial is perfectly powered to get the results of primary infections. You always have to power your study before you can register it, before you can start recruiting, before you get sponsorship. You have to know how many people are going to be in the study, and it has to do with a lot of things. The recruitment, the likelihood of your intervention to work. If you're going to see whether or not parachutes work with people jumping out of planes, you don't need to power that study really high to figure that out because we kind of know that parachutes are really effective, at least we think so. And so it's not like you're going to need a study of 10,000 people jumping out of planes to figure out that parachutes work. That kind of powering of the study could be done on maybe 2 or 3 people. It wouldn't be a very ethical study, but nevertheless, that's the kind of thing that we're talking about here. You look at the intervention, guess how many people you're going to need, what the event rates are, how many people you're going to have with endpoints, and then figure out whether or not it's going to meet statistical significance. And all of these companies came up with the same idea. Notice what else they came up with. They all decided to say, hey, are we going to look for interruption of transmission, person-to-person spread? Moderna said nope. Pfizer said nope. AstraZeneca in both the United States and the UK said nope. Johnson & Johnson said nope, Sinopharm said nope, and Sinovac said nope. And why did they say that? Because of exactly what we just talked about. You're going to wait for somebody to get infected and then watch them and wait longer and then see whether or not other people around them get infected? Why? You can do that after emergency use authorization. You can do post-marketing studies to see whether or not that actually happens. It makes no sense whatsoever for a vaccine company to make that kind of an endpoint in a study that needs to get done quickly and efficiently, and a time when people are dying in the hospital. So let's look at what was happening. Here we have new confirmed COVID-19 cases per million people. So this is on a daily basis, and you can see here this blue bar is the period of time in which the phase 3 trial occurred. This was pretty early on. Notice, not a lot of cases going on here. Not a lot of cases means that you're going to be hanging around for a while to reach that 30,000 or 36,000 requirement for subjects. Notice here in green, this is the United States, that the trial ended pretty quickly when cases started to go up. You can see them going up pretty rapidly here. That's when they were probably able to meet their endpoint of 30,000. And then they packaged up the data, they sent it up to the FDA and given emergency use authorization on December 11th, which you can see right here. Everything after that is post-marketing. Everything up to this point is pre-market. And again, the question was to Pfizer, did you do any research or have an endpoint in your study that looked at transmission from primary to secondary endpoints? And the answer was no. And we've just discovered that that wasn't a dirty secret. That was well known, and that was kind of the industry standard. So there you go. Let's move on. And let's just be complete here and look at the actual data that Pfizer got. As you can see here, there was 18,000 people in the placebo arm and also over 18,000 people in the intervention arm. And look at the numbers we're talking about here. 162 people came down with COVID in that short period of time, and 8 people in the vaccinated. And they were able to calculate a 95% efficacy. The absolute risk reduction was 0.85%. This is the Johnson & Johnson, but we're not talking about Johnson & Johnson. We're talking about Pfizer because they were being questioned by members of the European Parliament. So let's take a look and see, in the words of the FDA, why did they give them this emergency use authorization? And they say here in their news release on December 11th, 2020, quote, the FDA has determined that the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine has met the statutory criteria for issuance of an EUA. The totality of the available data provides clear evidence that Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine may be effective in what? Preventing COVID-19. It doesn't say here that it's effective at preventing spreading it or that it is effective at preventing death from COVID-19 or hospitalization from COVID-19. No, it's simply saying that it's effective at preventing COVID-19. What's implied here is in the recipient. And just to nail that point home, further on in this FDA news release that was released on December 11th, 2020, it states here, at this time, data are not available to make a determination about how long the vaccine will provide protection, nor is there evidence that the vaccine prevents transmission of SARS-CoV-2 from person to person. So it's very clear here that the FDA is being very specific about what it does know and what it does not know. Of course, there will be post-marketing data and research that will help to clarify those questions. To highlight that again, Pfizer not only did not look at endpoints for transmission to other people, but also did not look at reduction in severe COVID-19, admission, ICU, or even death. Pfizer was not alone. Moderna didn't do it, and in fact, none of the others did it. Here in the UK, there's a little kind of an asterisk there which talks about a trial registration where they actually did look at that, but for the most part, across the board here, nobody's looking at those endpoints. And it's pretty obvious when you think about why that's the case. One of the things that I think is really important, and I say this a lot to my students, and I think it is applicable here, is this statement. The absence of evidence does not equal the evidence of absence. In other words, just because Pfizer-BioNTech did not make in their phase 3 trials before marketing the endpoint of transmission, it doesn't mean that the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine doesn't prevent transmission. And why would I say that? Well, there's a number of trials that actually looked at this after marketing. So here's an article. We're not going to go through all of these. I just want to show you that it's not like we're just pulling this out of thin air. There's hard data that was published in peer-reviewed journals that looked at this. This is a correspondence to the New England Journal of Medicine. And notice a lot of these studies were done in August. This was published in August, so you know that the work actually was done earlier in the year, between January 4, so this was done almost immediately, and February 28, 2021, there was almost 1 million household contacts of unvaccinated index patients, and there was 96,000 secondary cases of COVID-19. So they're looking at these secondary cases. And what did they find? Overall, the likelihood of household transmission was approximately 40 to 50% lower in household of index patients who had been vaccinated 21 days or more before testing positive than in households of unvaccinated index patients. This is data that shows that the vaccine prevents transmission. Now, was it done by Pfizer, and was it done by Pfizer before marketing? No. But that doesn't mean it wasn't done. Again, the absence of evidence doesn't equal the evidence of absence. Study number 2, American Journal of Epidemiology, March 3rd, 2022, published. Compared with unvaccinated and unisolated adult teenagers aged greater than 12 years, contacts vaccination reduced the risk of infection among unisolated adult teenager contacts. Relative risk is 0.21. That's an 80% reduction here in this cohort of the vaccine. In isolation, they say reduced the risk of infection among unvaccinated adult teenagers even more. Relative risk there was 0.12. That's an 88% relative risk reduction. Within households, vaccination reduced both the risk of infection and of transmission if infected. When contacts were unvaccinated, isolation also led to important reductions in the risk of transmission. So again, here's another paper that was published, this one in March of this year, that shows clearly that vaccination reduces transmission. Here's another one, very prestigious journal, Science. published March, because a lot of the data was done prior to that. Before June 1st, 2021, they're looking at 10 to 90 days after the second dose. They say here, vaccination reduced susceptibility to infection by 89%, whereas vaccine effectiveness against infectiousness given infection was 23% during the days 10 to 90 after the second dose before June 1st, 2021. They go on, vaccination can prevent transmission by both providing protection against infection and reducing the infectiousness of vaccinated individuals who do become infected. Neither of these are typically directly measured in vaccine trials. Let me repeat that. Neither of these are typically directly measured in vaccine trials. This is pretty common knowledge. I remember this when I was thinking about getting the vaccine. I was looking at the data. I didn't just do it blindly. I looked at the phase 3 trial, and I remember specifically that was the discussion that we were having at the time. There is good data that it prevents me from getting infected, although we don't have data that it will stop me from transmitting it to somebody else, which is a big concern of mine. I work in the ICU, and I could bring something home to my family, and I have people living with me that are susceptible. I still decided to get vaccinated, even though I knew there was no trial data from the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine trial data phase 3 trials that showed that it prevented transmission. Everyone knew that. They say here, by analyzing data on confirmed SARS-CoV-2 infections among household members in Israel, we provide measures of effectiveness of BNT162b2, which is the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, against susceptibility to infection and against infectiousness given infection. Our results show evidence of a slight reduction in the infectiousness of vaccinated individuals who become infected, in addition to protection against susceptibility to infection, lending to an overall reduction in the risk of transmission. This is the third paper now that shows exactly what we've been talking about. There's another paper, the indirect effect of mRNA-based COVID-19 vaccination on healthcare workers, unvaccinated household members. This was published in March of this year. And here they used an administrative nationwide data set of SARS-CoV-2 infections, vaccination records, demographics, unique household IDs. They conducted an observational cohort study to estimate the direct and indirect effectiveness of mRNA-based COVID-19 vaccines in reducing infections among vaccinated healthcare workers and their unvaccinated household members. They say our estimates for adults imply indirect effectiveness of 39.1%, 2 weeks, and 39.0% 8 weeks after the second dose. We find that the indirect effect of mRNA-based COVID-19 vaccines within households is smaller for unvaccinated children than for adults and statistically insignificant. Here we show that mRNA-based COVID-19 vaccines are associated with a reduction in SARS-CoV-2 infections not only among vaccinated individuals, but also among unvaccinated household members in a real-world setting. This is published in Nature, peer-reviewed. Here's another paper. 146,000 tested contacts of 108,000 index patients. 37% had positive SARS-CoV-2 PCR tests. In index patients who became infected with the alpha variant, 2 vaccinations with either Pfizer or the AstraZeneca, as compared with no vaccination, were independently associated with a reduced PCR positivity with contacts. What was their conclusion in the study? Vaccination was associated with a smaller reduction in transmission of the Delta variant than of the Alpha variant, and the effects of vaccination decreased over time. PCR-CT values at diagnosis of the index patient only partially explain decreased transmission. These studies are not funded by the pharmaceutical companies. This one particularly here was funded by the UK government, Department of Health and Social Care, and others, and published in the prestigious New England Journal of Medicine. Let's recap here. Did Pfizer-BioNTech do studies that had as endpoints transmission of the virus? And the answer is no. They did not do that prior to emergency use authorization. Does that mean those studies have not been done? Does that mean that we have no basis of understanding for whether or not the vaccines can reduce transmission? No. The absence of evidence prior to EUA does not mean evidence of absence. Here we have clear evidence of presence that actually shows that there is decreased transmission when people are vaccinated. It's not 100%, but it's certainly not 0%. And you can see here clearly on the graph, they didn't have a lot of time. They needed to get to their endpoint, and their endpoint was preventing disease in the recipient. That was the FDA-approved, FDA-authorized indication, as we read directly from the source dated December 11th, 2020. So you may be asking this question. If those endpoints like death, transmission, hospitalization, if they're so rare that you're not even willing to do a study on it because it takes so long to do, then why are we so concerned about these things? If it's so rare, then why do we even have to be vaccinated in the first place? Let's answer that question. notice that the prevalence of the disease during the phase 3 trials of Pfizer were much smaller than, let's say, here, or here when we get to Delta, or even here, which is practically 10 times the amount when we get to Omicron. So I think what we need to do is look at this from a different standpoint. 1% sounds like a really small number. In fact, it is a small number when you're talking about recruitment for a trial. But when you're talking about 1% dying in a population overall, and it takes some time for the virus to spread, but in a population of 350 million people in the United States, and when you're talking about that on a daily basis, hundreds of thousands of people are actually coming down with the virus, there are downstream consequences to those problems. This graph right up here is the daily confirmed cases. It's exactly like the graph we showed before, except here it's just the United States that we're looking at, and we're actually looking at raw numbers here. That first wave that hit us in December, I mean, there were other waves, but the biggest wave here that really hit us, notice here that 200,000 to 300,000 people a day are coming down with COVID. If your hospitalization rate is 3.4%, and what's 3.4% of 300,000? Well, 1% of 100,000 is 1,000. 1% of 300,000 is 3,000. And 3% of that would be 9,000, potentially going to the hospital on a daily basis. We don't have to actually do the math because, fortunately, our world in data helps us with that. We have a graph here that looks at the number of COVID-19 patients in hospital. The key that I want to show you here is the number of COVID-19 patients in the intensive care unit. How many regular ICU beds do we have in the United States? 59,000 regular ICU beds is what we have in the United States. And if we look here at the number of COVID-19 patients in the intensive care unit, in that first wave, there was 30,000 total patients at that point in the intensive care unit. 30,000 from COVID-19. If you're a hospital and you're trying to make money, you're going to make sure that you have perfect staffing for your ICU. That means the number of patients that need to have ICU care, you're going to have your ICU sized correctly so that it's not too big, it's not too small. And you're going to have the number of ICU nurses that you need to have in perfect ratio for those patients available so that you can call them. And of course, there's going to be ups and downs, but you're going to be able to flex with that. What we see here during this time period is a tremendous surge, unlike we have ever seen. There was a period of time where I literally worked 35 days without taking a break. There were nurses in the intensive care unit where I was working that normally would be seeing just 2 patients. That's their ratio. I work in California, and very strict rules on that. They were seeing 4 patients, and it was because California had basically released everybody from those strict standards. And I would really love people who went through similar experiences to write in the comments. There were nurses that actually developed PTSD from this period. There were people that literally came in and died within minutes, people that were dying in ambulances. There was a period of time that we were almost out of ventilators. We thought we had enough ventilators, but they were actually disposable ventilators and would not work for patients with COVID-19. The point is that we had so many people coming in to the hospital that we could not take care of them. And so this caused us to have to come up with something called a crisis protocol. So I want to show you here an example we've talked about before. Idaho is an example, but there's many other states that we could talk about. They were 47th out of 50 in terms of the levels of vaccination. And they experienced a tremendous influx of patients to the hospital that were sick during this time, and they just could not be taken care of. And so what had to happen during the Delta surge, September 6, 2021, well before any kind of federal mandate on healthcare providers being vaccinated. As you can see here, Idaho is a dark blue state, and their mandate vaccination was February 14th of 2022, and their second one was to be March 15th of 2022. So this is well before any kind of vaccine mandates caused nurses to go into shortage. We see here multiple activations and expansions of crisis care. This was also happening to a degree in Utah, Montana, and also happening in Texas. These were in areas where vaccination rates were low. And you can look this up and see it for yourself. This is a healthcare crisis protocol from the state of Nebraska, dated May 10th, 2021, published by the Nebraska Medical Emergency Operations Center. This is not unique to Nebraska. Every state has one, and it basically looks the same. When we were working here in Southern California, the state came to us and said, you need to come up with a crisis protocol so that when you run out of nurses, ventilators, dialysis machines, you know how you're going to allocate scarce resources. The foundation of this approach to healthcare crisis protocol is that such difficult decisions must be based on criteria that ensure that every patient has equitable access to any care from which they might benefit. When this happens, it doesn't matter if you have COVID-19 or don't have COVID-19, regardless of whatever disease you have. If you have a heart attack, if you're driving in a car and get into a car accident, if you've got a cold, it doesn't matter what it is, and you come into the hospital, you're going to have a crisis protocol done. You're going to be triaged into how sick you are and what kind of resources are going to be allocated to you. And that has nothing to do with how well you are able to get over COVID-19. How good your immune system is going to have no bearing on the fact that you are in a car accident and you need to have surgery. If this gets implemented, you're going to have limited resources at the hospital that you would be going to. What does this actually mean? Well, let me show you. So this is called the care continuum. Conventional, this is what we're doing all the time. Usual patient space, usual staff, normal supplies, usual care. Contingency, things get a little bit ramped up. Once you hit crisis, we're putting people in classrooms. We're putting people in garage structures. We're getting trained staff unavailable at this point. There's just nobody there. We got a patient on the ventilator. Normally, a respiratory therapist would be taking care of them. There isn't one. So what do? We extend the number of people that can take care of it, or we say instead of taking care of 5 patients tonight, you're taking care of 10. Critical supplies lacking and possible reallocation of life-sustaining procedures. What's the standard of care now? It's healthcare crisis protocol. So whereas before, if somebody had an appendicitis, they would get surgery. Not anymore. We don't have those resources. We can't provide that care because we've overstretched our healthcare industry, because we have too many people coming to the emergency room and the hospital. Special considerations for reallocation of life-sustaining treatments. There are specific ethical issues involved in withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment. These issues may be particularly pronounced when resources are withdrawn from critically ill patients who are already receiving them at a time that a healthcare crisis protocol is initiated. That means Mr. Jones came in a week ago. He's still on the ventilator, but now we have so many people that have come in. It's not a first-come, first-served basis. However, in the event of a worsening crisis, adhering to a first-come, first-served principle for those who are already receiving critical care prior to the application of healthcare crisis protocol may result in unjust allocation of resources. That means if we have somebody further down on the ladder, even though they came in first, may get the ventilator taken off of them and put onto somebody else who is deemed to be a better allocation. They say, as such, careful assessment and allocation will be necessary in order to maximize benefit during a crisis. This was the issue at our hospital, is I thought it would be unethical for me to be involved in those decisions. I did not want to be the ICU doctor taking care of these patients, and then for them to come to me and say, we want you to pick the person that is going to basically come off the ventilator. That would be very difficult for me to live with that kind of a decision. But somebody has to make that decision. COVID-19 is like an elephant in a room that's dark, and we're all feeling different parts of this elephant. Someone's feeling the feet, and they think it's a tree. I'm feeling the trunk, and I think it's a snake. I experienced COVID-19 in this kind of environment, where people were coming into the intensive care unit, and they were dying in such vast numbers that I never want to see that ever again. I never want to see a activation of healthcare crisis protocols where we are taking people off of resources because we just don't have enough of them. And that is the reason why I have been so motivated in these last 2 years to come up with any piece of Swiss cheese that I can possibly get that will stop people from having to come to the hospital. This is the reason why I introduced hydrotherapy in my intensive care unit. This is the reason why I introduced black seed oil in the dietary plans of patients on the floor that could still eat. I didn't care if we had randomized placebo-controlled trial data to say yes or no. If the risks was sufficiently low and there was nothing to lose, I was willing to do it because I don't ever want to see that happen again. I want to tell you exactly why I'm talking about this, why there is this understanding that vaccines reduce transmission is because we actually have studies that demonstrate this. And we don't need to have a pre-marketing study done by the manufacturer to show that this is in fact the case. In fact, in no other vaccine company that has made a COVID-19 vaccine has that been the case. That's number one. Number two, we have limited resources in our healthcare industry. If a significant amount of people are not protected against the virus, there is going to be a lot of people going to the hospital, and there are going to be a lot of difficult decisions made. And I don't want to see that. That's why I am for early treatment. That's why we promote those things on medcram.com. That has been my goal in the last 2 years, to prevent death, hospitalization, and illness from this and any other virus. I usually stick strictly to data, but you can't separate out your personal experiences sometimes. I hope this explanation has been helpful. Thanks for joining us.